So I wanted to record the lecture since we're not going to actually have class this week. So that way, to kind of give you a little bit of context, this won't take very long. This week is kind of a little bit of a shortened kind of content. So we'll be covering a lot of information about reform and even kind of women's actions in the Civil War. The week of the 28th. And then the last week of class on the 5th, we'll be looking at Reconstruction and kind of how women are transitioning from kind of this mid 19th century to what is essentially kind of the foundation of the modern age. So this week's main theme is going to be kind of Western expansion, but I also kind of tacked onto this and the concept of Western expansion, the idea that of crisis, that it is this Western expansion that leads to the pressures that ultimately result in the Civil War. So you can see the date range is 1830 to 1859. Oh, excuse me, it's like 6 o'clock in the morning. Okay, well, there we go. So first off, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit. So we've talked about the establishment of the market economy and the growth of the cotton economy and how there was so much demand for cotton. In addition, one thing that I kind of alluded to the week before last, 2 weeks ago, was this idea of panics and booms and bust. So you have what is essentially a global system of trade, and that global trade causes prices to fluctuate. So the United States is providing a ton of raw materials for the European for the textile mills, and we're selling crops, and we're buying products and all this kind of stuff. So we're very much engaged in this global economy. Well, we know from the 21st century that a global economy can fluctuate, right? That one thing that happens in another country can affect things here. And that's even true even in the 1820s, 1830s. Now, what's going to be probably the biggest factor is, of course, going to be Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson coming in, killing the Bank of the United States because he's convinced that they're corrupt and that they've got an undue influence in government, and which to be fair, the Bank of the U.S. did kind of have an undue influence, but it also provided stability to the economy, right? It prevented these small independent banks at the state level from coming up and causing inflation and causing the economic cycle to go up and down and up and down. So when he kills the Bank of the United States, that's what replaces it are these series of small state banks. And these small state banks get involved in what we would know as speculation, right? Speculation on making loans for people to buy land so that they can buy plantations and grow cotton and that kind of thing. So you're having these frequent kind of boom and bust. Most of them are relatively small. There's a few that are really big. The Panic of 1819 is a really big one. After Jackson leaves office, I think it's 1837, there's another panic that causes a problem. And I think there's a small recession in like the early 1850s. So you have these moments. Excuse me. Oh. Again, it's like 6:25. Oh. I love football season. I'm just telling you. Anyways, so you have them essentially kind of financing this kind of expansion westward, and it's into this environment of boom and bust cycles where farmers go belly up, or where people become land hungry, or where they seek new opportunities, that you have this movement into Texas, and so people start moving into Texas in large numbers. Of course, if you remember anything from elementary school or middle school, you talked about Stephen F. Austin and his, original 300 and all that kind of stuff. I'm not really going to talk about that part of it. I will mention that initially your first wave of immigrants coming into Texas were people that embraced the idea that was the purpose for settling there, which is the opportunity to have land to grow cotton, and they accepted the exchange with the Mexican government. That is, they have this wonderful land grant with which they can be successful, and so they can be successful there. In exchange, they're supposed to assimilate within Mexican culture. So in many cases, in order to get that land grant, they have to sign an agreement that says We're going to learn Spanish. We're going to convert to Catholicism. We promise to respect the Mexican government. So very kind of ironic given our current immigration state of affairs, right? So you had lots of Americans coming into Texas, signing off on these land grants. And initially, the first groups of them tried to kind of comply. But what will happen is more and more will come in, and they will tend to start saying, oh, we don't really have to do that. We don't, we can just pretend like we're doing that. They bring their slaves with them. And slavery was illegal in Mexico. Remember, Mexico had been founded by the Spanish, and they had trouble with Christians owning other Christians. And so they basically did not have a slave system. Now, they did have peonage. So there were lots of really poor people who were exploited. So I don't want you to think that Mexico didn't have exploitation of labor, because they absolutely did. But it wasn't slavery, right? And while there's not a huge difference, there's some important differences, some key things like not ripping families apart, some key things like technically owning your person. If they aren't going to go after you if you leave. Now, they might be very difficult for you to leave, but they're not going to chase you down and hunt you down, right? So there's some important distinctions between the peonage system and the slave system. But Americans bring their slave system into Texas. And so Mexico, which is a young country, right? It had only been independent for about 15 years or so. So Mexico is really kind of struggling with, what do we do with these Americans that don't want to follow the rules that we've laid down, that continue to ignore what it is we're trying to do. And for Mexico, the problem was that they had the Comanches that were kind of over in West Texas, kind of sweeping down from the Panhandle area, even coming as far as into what we would consider the Dallas area. And so the Comanches were a fierce force, right? Some historians argue that they were their own kind of empire in the early 1800s, and they certainly controlled vast swaths of land, and they were known as vicious fighters, right? They were extremely good on a horse. They were extremely good with bows and arrows, and the guns at this point, prior to the 1850s, are these really inefficient, inaccurate kind of weapons. And so there's no competition, right? A Comanche on horseback with bow and arrow is way more deadly than somebody holding a gun, right? And so the Comanches really have a great deal of control in that region. And so Mexico's kind of taking the attitude of, well, if we get these Americans to come in and settle, then they can be Comanche fodder. They can settle this frontier. And maybe we can start to get control of this region. Because remember, they control this vast swath of territory from Texas to New Mexico, or Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, right? So for them, they need all the help they can get to get this place settled. And a lot of Mexican citizens either don't have the resources to move there, or are not inclined to be subject to the Comanches, right? And be kidnapped and all that kind of stuff. So this is the issue that's happening with kind of the American settlement of Mexico. Now, what will happen as we're going into 1836 and the Texas independence is that Mexico finally has enough with these kind of recalcitrant and difficult Americans who refuse to assimilate, and they keep bringing slaves, and then they get told that, oh no, you're not supposed to have slaves, and then they just proceed to ignore it. So basically, Mexico starts to restrict American immigration coming into Texas. You combine this with the government of Santa Anna, which is, and I'm no expert in Mexican history, but from my kind of superficial, when the story of Mexico and Texas have kind of intersected, Santa Anna, at the very least, is incredibly corrupt. He's kind of an odd leader. His government has a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of issues with it, and it's really kind of about funneling the wealth to the people around Santa Anna. And so, that's not to justify, or that's not to pretend that, oh, it was this grand battle for independence on the same lines as the American Revolution. Well, first off, I would argue that the American Revolution is really not some grand battle, right? I mean, you have the influence of the Enlightenment saying, oh, we should have natural rights, and that no one should take away your natural rights. And so definitely the foundation of this country is founded on these kind of profound ideas. But in reality, the founding fathers were just trying to go back to a system where wealth stayed at the top, right? And where wealthy men could control politics instead of having to answer to a king. And so, like, I think you have kind of the same attitude coming into Texas and Texas independence, which is, how dare Mexico tell us what to do? So they end up declaring independence. You have the whole thing with the Alamo and San Jacinto and all that kind of stuff. And so Texas becomes an independent country. Now, a big part of the plan from the get-go was that Texas would become a part of the United States. Remember, it's been settled by all these Southern Americans, and they want to become a part of the U.S. But because of the slavery issue, because everyone knows that Texas is being settled by these slaves, or not slaves, by slave owners and slaves, that Texas is going to need to come in as a slave state. And so we have that Missouri Compromise of 1820 that says, no, it has to be one slave, one free, and that's the only way people can come in. And so this creates this problem with admitting Texas. So Texas kind of ends up having its admission to the Union delayed, largely because of the Missouri Compromise. Most of your leaders wanted Texas to become a part of the United States. There's a couple like Mary B. Lamar that somehow thought Texas could exist as its own country, but in reality, this idea of Texas secession is nonsense. That first off, we rejoined after the Civil War, but otherwise, the whole issue of Texas being an independent country was never particularly viable at any rate. So it is independent from 1836 to 1845. Lots of political drama surrounding kind of Texas coming in. Texas does come in a unique manner. It's kind of by a treaty, by an act of Congress. That is unusual. So even Abraham Lincoln in 1861 will say the only state that legitimately could succeed was Texas. Now, again, that's prior to us rejoining the Union after the Civil War. But that being said, Texas does have a little bit of a unique story, but it's largely because of this issue, over slavery. The other thing I would say is that you have a lot of debate over what is the southern boundary of Texas. First off, Mexico never really recognizes Texas independence, so there's some argument that maybe it was not a legitimate annexation by the United States. Also, there's a debate over where the boundary would have been. Is it the Nueces River, which is a little farther north, or is it the Rio Grande? So we've got lots of tensions that are kind of simmering around 1845 over, what Texas looks like. But Texas does become a part of the United States, kind of heightens up this issue with. Heightens the issue with sorry, totally lost my train of thought, over slavery, right? Over this issue of what states are going to be free, what states are going to be slave. This gets tangled up with the Compromise of 1850 and all that kind of stuff, which we'll talk about here in a second. The other thing I want to mention is you have a bunch of trails moving westward. There's really two waves of western migration. One is this first wave that's happening around 1830, kind of late 1820s, going all the way up into about 1852, 1853. And so one of the first ways that people come over is the Mormon Trail. We'll touch on the Mormons briefly the week after next, when we talk about reform, because one of the things that happens is that this market economy creates such frustration economically, that it creates these religious groups, right? And there's all kinds of different religious groups, but Mormons kind of come out of this period. And of course, they go from New York, they go to Illinois. They basically get run out of town. Their leader gets killed. And so Brigham Young leads them westward so they can establish their own place where they won't be attacked and persecuted. Now, of course, at this point in the 19th century, Mormons believed in polygamy. This is a big part of why they're being attacked. As well as they have some very kind of, they have not kind of your standard view of Christianity. Like their view of Christianity is different than what your more traditional kind of Protestant faiths are, especially coming out of the Second Great Awakening, which is kind of this other religious expansion that said, you're supposed to have kind of this deep relationship with God, and you're supposed to repent, and you're supposed to do good works and all this kind of stuff. So there's this religious movement taking place in the around 1830 that's really kind of trying to deal with the market economy and the fact that the market economy makes people feel very vulnerable, very much kind of like they are left out of the system, right? And so you have the Mormon Trail, then you're going to have things like the Oregon Trail. This is where you have the Donner Party, if you ever heard about them. They, ate their family members. Anyways, they got trapped in the Sierra Nevadas. And really that what's happening is kind of seeing California as this land of opportunity, that California has all this great stuff. Now, this happens before independence, before the United States gets California. It's happening while California is under Mexican control. You have Americans coming in, not quite to the same extent that you do to Texas, because California is a lot farther away. You're either crossing this very difficult terrain, crossing mountain ranges, dealing with Native Americans, or you're sailing around the coast, around the tip of South America. Both of those trips are very dangerous. So you do have Americans coming there in kind of under the Mexican system. But just not in the same quantity, right? The other thing I would say about California is that you have lots of Chinese immigration. And kind of as a kind of side note, so China had been taken advantage of significantly by European countries. And so this creates a lot of economic instability, a lot of population instability. And so the Chinese are attracted to California. Some of it's due to the gold rush that attracts a lot of them, but you had some Chinese that had been there before, kind of pushed out of being in China. But the gold rush is really the one that kind of solidifies Chinese immigration. They start relying on a lot of Chinese workers. And then when we start building the Transcontinental Railroad, they're foundational for that. Kind of on a side note about women. So kind of a couple of concepts. First off, you don't have a lot of Chinese women coming over. You have a few. It's mostly men. When they do bring women over, not all, but a lot of the Chinese women are being sold as sex slaves. They're being forced into prostitution to pay back their transportation fees. So they're really kind of horrible conditions for the Chinese women when they come over. And, for the women that are on the trail, this is a pretty miserable existence, right? This is a long trip, takes a couple of months over dangerous terrain, riding in a wagon. Women on this trail ride had to take care of the kids. They had to prepare the food. They had to try to keep all the traditional kind of gender things that we talked about with the cult of domesticity, that middle class women kind of ran the house and ran the food and took care of the clothes and took care of the kids. And women on the trail had the same problem, except that they're dealing with being on the trail, right? I mean, imagine 2 months of camping. And, they're dealing, some of them, are trying to deal with illness. They're trying to deal with pregnancy, trying to deal with newborns. So it's a really difficult condition. So that you can really kind of, without me having to give you a whole lot of detail, imagine how awful it was for women traveling on these trails. Now, some of these women are going to seek the opportunity to be out there. Some of the women are going to be forced to by their husbands, right? Husbands that are wanting to find their own opportunity, that are frustrated with the market economy and kind of the wage exploitation of the factories, and the fact that they can't get financing so they can buy a plantation or whatever. There's not any land for farms because the big plantation owners are buying them all up. And so, which is another factor, right? Which is the plantation owners with their slaves and their lines of credit could then afford to buy up land, which drove land prices up, right? So if you're a small, ordinary farmer, you're going to feel like your only option is to hop on a wagon and travel to unknown territory, right? And so women were often kind of forced to go along with that, or maybe they embraced it. Regardless, it was a very hard trip. So that's one aspect. And then when they finally get to where they're going, they have to establish their own communities again. They have to build a home. Very difficult and hard life that, again, the men could not do without the women, right? And I mentioned kind of the polygamy of the Mormon Trail, and that's kind of an interesting side note if you're talking about different kinds of ways of responding to the market economy. The gold rush provides a lot of opportunities for women. Women typically did not come out to go mining, right? It wasn't that they wanted to mine for gold. The women that managed to come west often did so in order to provide support services. In other words, boarding houses, cooking meals, doing laundry. And the ones that set up businesses actually could be pretty successful. They could really command fair wages for what they were doing. This is a simple supply and demand issue, right? There's not enough women, first off. Second off, there's not enough people willing to do things like do the laundry and cook the food and, maintain a boarding house and all that kind of stuff, because the men are out digging, panning for gold all day. And so the women are able to kind of find that niche. And so there's really kind of this entrepreneurial spirit among a lot of the women that move out west. Now, I say a lot of the women, you still have, and you're not talking about huge numbers of women, but you do have some, and they typically are out there, trying to make a buck in whatever way they possibly can. In addition, they're going to have kind of, because of the gender disparity, they're going to have lots of opportunities to marry who they want, not marry who they want. Women will kind of be able to make their own rules out in the West, at least until you start to have the solidification of government control by the time you get to, say, the 1870s, 1880s. So you have kind of this brief moment where the West actually provides this kind of contrast of really harsh, rough conditions, dangerous, and yet at the same time, this grand opportunity. And this is really kind of, when I say the West, I'm talking about places like Nevada, Utah, California. Texas, because of its proximity to the Deep South, while it was risky and dangerous, it gets settled pretty quickly, right? And so it has forms of government in place far before places like Oregon and California. Well, Oregon and Utah and those kinds of places. Those tend to be very specific to their little communities. So Utah is led by the Mormons. California will see kind of a transition from Mexican government to kind of this, once California becomes a part of the United States, to an American government. But you still have lots and lots of towns that don't have much in the form of kind of government structures. That being said, the Plains Indians, when you're talking about 1840, 1850, you're starting to have pressures. We have things like the Fort Laramie Treaty that's supposed to kind of help negotiate kind of the tensions, because you have these waves of immigrants coming over. Now, the problem is that these waves of immigrants are not necessarily following the treaty, that kind of thing. So there is some attempt to kind of balance issues with the Plains Indians throughout the 1850s, really until you get to after the Civil War. Plains Indians still largely dominate the region, and I use that word kind of loosely in the sense that the waves of immigrants are creating pressures, they're creating tensions. You have skirmishes, you have conflicts. This is the purpose of the Fort Laramie Treaty and several other treaties that are made in the 1850s. And you have a couple of key incidences. 1862, you have a Sioux uprising that results in the execution of like 20 Sioux, approved by President Lincoln. Right after he signed the Emancipation, or came up with the Emancipation Proclamation. So you've got some interesting kind of contrast. But by and large, as long as the question of slavery is restraining kind of the control of the government, right? In other words, we can't find a way to negotiate the slave question. And since we can't find a way to negotiate the slave question, what's going to happen is that things kind of get put on hold, right? And so this is going to make it less likely for settlers to come over, which means that the Plains Indians will still have large swaths of territory to range on. There'll still be lots of buffalo herds. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of the last, this is the kind of the evening, if you will, of the Plains Indians culture. Because by the time you get to 1868, 1869, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the hunting of the buffalo, the reservation system as we understand it, you're going to see a complete change in the way Native Americans have to respond. Politicians in the press, completely support expansion. You have this notion of manifest destiny, John Sullivan's "Go West, Young Man," and so you have kind of this notion that everyone's behind this. Now, politically, you have kind of this hodgepodge. After Jackson, who was this really strong president, now probably not a very good president, but he was a really strong president. He's replaced by Van Buren and a succession of kind of no-name presidents is what I call them. Like they're, we kind of think, okay, Fillmore and Tyler and Taylor and, like you can kind of, and Buchanan, like you can remember these names, but trying to remember the order of them, even I teach this all the time, even I have to stop and really think to get the order right. So you have all these nameless presidents, and these presidents, for the most part, are either neutral and let Congress do what they want on Western expansion, or they are diehard supporters of it. Most famously, President Polk, who is the one who's president when Texas, when you have the Mexican-American War, and then you've got, of course, Zachary Tyler, who kind of helped usher in the treaty agreement that kind of brought Texas into the United States. So you have lots of politicians that support this idea of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is the notion that God intends for the United States to go from coast to coast. And that's what we are supposed to be doing. So that being said, I think I'm going to pause here so that way I don't make one massively long video. And then I'll pick up with slide 3.